You ever notice how storms sound different when you're alone? Not just the wind against the glass, but the way silence waits between the thunder, like it's holding its breath for what you'll do next. Tonight, on a rocky coast in Maine, an old lighthouse blinks through the rain, and a man who swore he'd never pray again hears a child crying on the dock. If this were your night, would you go? Would you risk the water that once took everything? Stay with me, because what Elias Turner does in the next few minutes might change more than one life. And if you've ever stood at the edge of something you feared, this story is for you. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. Isaiah 43:2. Before we begin, quick question. Have you ever felt God was silent until the exact second you needed him most? Tell me in the comments if you've lived a moment like that. Your story might lift someone tonight. And if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this journey. Now take a breath. Hear the horn. See that thin blade of light cutting the rain. Elias is stepping out the door with a rope and a lantern, and a promise he thought he'd buried with his past. The tide is rising. The minutes are loud. Let's go to the dock. The ocean didn't wait for nightfall to start its rage. By late afternoon, the horizon had vanished behind a thick wall of gray, and the air tasted of salt and electricity. Elias Turner stood at the lighthouse window, watching gulls fight the wind until they gave up and disappeared inland. The glass trembled under the pressure of the gusts, and the beams from the rotating lens cut through rain like a knife through cloth. In 71 years of life and 50 of keeping this lighthouse, Elias knew storms. This one was different. It wasn't just weather. It was a warning. The wind carried voices sometimes. At least that's what it felt like. Not real words, but low, rolling hums that seemed to curl between the crashing waves. He used to believe those sounds were the sea speaking to him, but that was before the night it took his son. Now he dismissed them as tricks of memory. Still, as the gale rattled the roof tonight, something in the rhythm made him turn his head, as if someone was calling from far beyond the breakers. He told himself it was nothing, yet didn't step away from the glass. The lamp above him rotated with its slow, patient grace, casting stripes of light across the black water. Down below, the narrow dock twisted in the current, its wet planks slapping against the pilings like teeth chattering. He could smell seaweed and diesel from the fishing boats tied nearby, their hulls banging together in restless protest. The rope coil on the dock lay half unraveled, whipping slightly with each gust. Elias rubbed the back of his neck, an unease settling into his bones the way cold does before a storm turns ugly. In the keeper's quarters, the stove hissed, and the scent of burning cedar crept into the hallway. He should have been grateful for the warmth, but it only reminded him of how the fire couldn't reach the damp that lived permanently in these stone walls. His tea sat untouched, steam thinning into nothing. Outside, the wind whistled through the gaps in the shutters, long drawn-out notes that rose and fell like sighs. They weren't pleasant. They weren't random. They were too steady, too deliberate. Elias pulled on his oilskin coat, the heavy yellow fabric stiff from years of salt spray. The hood shadowed his face, but his eyes stayed fixed on the edge of the dock, where the light caught something pale and out of place. He narrowed his gaze, the rain stinging his cheeks. It could have been a scrap of sailcloth, or maybe just foam clinging to the wood, but it didn't move like foam. It shifted, like it was breathing. A sudden gust slammed against the lighthouse door, the hinges crying in protest. He reached for the latch, his fingers pausing when he realized the wind's howl had changed. It wasn't the high-pitched shriek of a gale anymore. It was broken, uneven, almost like a sob. He swallowed hard, the sound tugging at a memory he didn't want. Some storms are loud because of the wind. Others are loud because of what they carry in. He stepped outside, the lantern swinging in his grip. Rain hit him sideways, cold needles against the thin skin of his cheeks. The ground under his boots was slick with moss, and the path to the dock felt longer than it had that morning. Each flash of lightning carved the world into pieces. Wet planks, whipping ropes, black water. Somewhere between two thunderclaps, he heard it again, a cry, faint but sharp, rising above the roar of the tide. Elias stopped at the start of the dock, the wood groaning beneath his weight. The pale shape he'd seen from the window shifted again, and this time he was sure. It was a small figure, curled tight, hands gripping the railing as if the sea itself were trying to take them. The lantern light caught wide, terrified eyes. For a moment, Elias couldn't move. It was too much like another night, another storm, and in that breath, he knew. He would either walk forward now or live haunted forever. The wind hit harder the moment Elias stepped onto the dock, each gust a shove that tried to turn him back. Rain slapped the hood of his coat in sharp bursts, dripping cold trails down his neck. The lantern swung wildly in his hand, casting erratic slices of light that made the shadows jump and stretch. He could barely see more than a few feet ahead, but the sound was there again, high, trembling, and human. Somewhere inside him, a voice whispered to leave it, to get back inside before the tide claimed him too. He kept walking. The dock creaked under his boots, each step matched by the groan of wood straining against the current. Beneath, the water churned, slamming against the pilings in a rhythm that felt too close, too impatient. A fishing buoy knocked against the side, its dull thud swallowed by the roar of the storm. The pale figure ahead shifted again, shoulders jerking with each sob. Elias tightened his grip on the lantern, forcing his legs to move, one careful step at a time. Every instinct screamed that time was running out. Lightning tore the sky in half, illuminating the child for just an instant. Small, drenched, clothes plastered to thin arms. Their hair clung to their face, eyes wide and unblinking in the sudden glare. Then darkness fell again, heavier than before, as if the storm had swallowed the light whole. Elias blinked away the afterimage, trying to fix those eyes in his mind. He knew that look. He had seen it once before, in a moment he could never erase. The cry came again, but weaker now, more like a gasp. Elias's boots slipped on the slick planks, and he caught himself on the railing, feeling the cold bite of wet rope under his hand. The smell of salt was sharp here, mixed with something metallic, blood maybe. The thought made his chest tighten. He pushed forward, lantern low, until its glow fell on trembling fingers clutching the wood. They were so small, the nails broken and raw. It didn't matter who they were. No one should be left here. A wave surged, smashing against the dock and sending spray high into the air. It caught Elias across the face, momentarily blinding him with salt water. He wiped his eyes just in time to see the child flinch, nearly losing their grip. The image twisted in his gut. How many times had he replayed another pair of small hands slipping away in the dark? Not again. Not tonight. He stepped closer, speaking low, his voice nearly swallowed by the wind. "Hold on. I'm coming." The child's gaze flicked toward him, uncertain, half hidden behind strands of wet hair. For a heartbeat they didn't move, as if unsure whether to trust the shadow in the storm. Elias kept talking, the words coming without thought, soft and steady. "You're safe now. I've got you." He reached out one hand, palm open, willing them to take it. Every second stretched thin, the world narrowed to that single space between his hand and theirs. Another flash of lightning lit the waves behind them, taller now, darker, curling like a fist ready to strike. Elias felt the dock sway under the pressure, the bolts in the planks groaning. He took one more step, his boots inches from the edge. The air was charged, his breath clouding in the cold. In that moment, there was no storm, no lighthouse, no past, only the fragile thread of connection between two people in the dark. Then the wave broke, exploding over them in a wall of icy water. Elias lunged, closing his hand around the child's wrist just as the dock pitched violently beneath them. Their grip was desperate, nails digging into his skin. The wind roared in his ears, the lantern swinging wide, throwing light in dizzying arcs. Somewhere deep inside, he knew the storm wasn't finished, but neither was he. The lantern's flame fought to stay alive, bending under the force of the wind as Elias pulled the child closer. Their small frame was soaked through, shaking so hard he could feel the tremors in his own arms. Rain streaked their face, mixing with tears until he couldn't tell them apart. "Easy now," he muttered, though his own voice was tight. Every muscle braced for the dock to give way. The planks beneath them groaned again, a deep, splintering protest that sent a cold warning up his spine. He kept one hand gripping the railing, the other locked firmly around the child's wrist. Lightning flashed, painting the world in stark white for a single breath. In that frozen light, Elias saw movement, a shadow slipping across the far end of the dock. Too large to be the wind, too fast to be just his imagination. He blinked hard, but the darkness swallowed everything again. His mind raced, unwilling to trust what his eyes claimed. The storm had a way of making shapes out of nothing, but it also had a way of hiding what you didn't want to see. The child clung to him, head buried against his chest. Their breaths were short and quick, like a bird trapped in a hand. He tried to shield them from the spray, adjusting his coat to cover as much as he could. Each wave slapped the dock harder than the last, sending a fine mist over them. Somewhere beneath the roar, there was a sound, low, rhythmic, almost like a knocking. It came from below, deep in the pilings, as though something was moving with the tide. Elias pushed the thought aside, telling himself it was just debris. He started guiding them back toward the lighthouse, step by careful step. The lantern's beam cut through the rain in jagged arcs, catching glimpses of rope coils, a drifting fender, and the dark gleam of seawater pooling between the planks. Behind them, the knocking sound came again, louder now, closer. The child tensed, turning their head just enough to glance over their shoulder. Elias didn't. Whatever it was, looking wouldn't change the fact that they needed to get off this dock now. Halfway to the safety of the stone steps, another shadow moved in the periphery. This time, Elias was sure he saw it, tall, human-shaped, vanishing behind the stacked lobster traps. His chest tightened, breath quickening despite the cold air burning his lungs. He told himself it could be another fisherman, stranded like them. But no one else had been here when the storm began. No one else should be here now. The child whispered something so faint it was nearly lost to the wind. He bent his head, straining to hear. "He's still here," they said, the words trembling, heavy with fear. Elias's grip on them tightened instinctively. He didn't ask who. He didn't want to hear the answer. Not yet. The sound of the knocking returned, this time with an uneven rhythm, like footsteps matching theirs on the wet board. A gust of wind tore the hood from his head, cold rain stinging his skin. The lighthouse loomed closer now, its beams sweeping over the dock, briefly lighting the empty stretch behind them. Empty, or so it seemed. Elias kept moving, forcing each step forward, the weight of the child a reminder of why he couldn't stop. The dock shuddered again, not from the waves this time, but from something heavier shifting on its surface. By the time they reached the bottom of the stone steps, Elias risked one last glance over his shoulder. The lantern light caught the edge of the dock, empty and still, yet the knocking sound didn't stop. It echoed through the storm, following them toward the lighthouse door, as if the night itself was walking in step. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind them, muting the storm but not silencing it. The walls of the lighthouse groaned under the wind's force, rain lashing against the glass panes above. Elias leaned his back against the door, still holding the child close. Their breaths were ragged, clothes dripping onto the stone floor, puddles forming around their feet. The scent of salt water and damp wool filled the small entryway, mingling with the faint aroma of the cedar logs burning in the stove. For a moment, they just stood there, catching what breath they could. The child's eyes darted around the room, wide and unsettled. Their small hands clutched Elias's coat, as though letting go would drop them back into the dark. He crouched to meet their gaze, pushing wet strands of hair from their forehead. "You're safe here," he said, though the words felt fragile. He wasn't entirely sure safety existed in a night like this. The beam from the lighthouse lens swept through the upper windows, casting a slow-moving band of light over the walls, as if reminding him the storm was still watching. A sharp thud echoed from somewhere below, deep in the stone base of the lighthouse. Elias straightened instantly, eyes narrowing toward the trap door that led to the maintenance room by the waterline. The sound came again, heavy, deliberate. The child flinched at each impact, their shoulders tightening under the oversized coat Elias had draped around them. "Stay here," he told them, though he already knew they wouldn't want to. His boots left wet prints as he crossed the floor. Before he could reach the trap door, another gust hit the lighthouse, rattling the shutters like skeletal fingers against the glass. The beam above flickered as the generator fought the surge, shadows swelling and shrinking along the wall. Somewhere outside, the knocking had returned, blending with the storm's howl. It was slower now, more patient, almost as if whoever, or whatever, it belonged to, was waiting for the right moment. Elias's hand hovered over the iron latch. Memories bled in without permission. Another night, another storm, a desperate rush to secure the lower door before the tide swallowed the dock. Only that time he had been too late. He clenched his jaw, forcing the image back into the dark corners of his mind. Tonight would be different. Tonight, he would not fail. The child's voice broke the tension, soft but urgent. "Please don't open it." Elias turned, their face pale in the shifting light. Their eyes weren't on him but on the floorboards, as if they could see something beneath them. "It's him," they whispered. Elias felt the weight of the words, their certainty cutting through the storm's noise. He wanted to ask who, but something in their tone told him he didn't want the answer yet. Another blow landed against the lower wall, harder this time, sending a shiver up through the stone. The lantern hanging by the door swung on its hook, casting wild arcs of light that seemed to chase invisible figures across the room. The child pressed themselves against the wall, their breathing quickening again. Elias kept one hand on the latch, torn between facing what was outside and keeping the barrier closed. The wind screamed through a crack in the shutter, a high, piercing note that made him glance toward the upper stairs. The light from the tower room spilled halfway down, steady now, as if urging him upward instead of down. He looked from the trap door to the staircase, the choice pressing against him like the weight of the storm itself. Outside, the knocking stopped, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise had ever been. The staircase groaned under Elias's weight as he climbed toward the tower room, each step slick from the damp air seeping through the old stone. The child's footsteps were light but hurried behind him, their presence close enough for him to feel the tremor in their movements. Above, the glass chamber waited, its lens turning with a slow, steady rhythm, casting a pale glow over the spiral walls. Outside, the storm was a living thing, its voice rising and falling in long, mournful wails that wrapped around the lighthouse like chains. Elias reached the top, the wind's breath slapping through a cracked pane. The view from the tower was chaos, black sea, white foam, and the occasional flash of lightning slicing open the horizon. Far below, the dock was barely visible, shuddering under the relentless tide. Elias scanned the water, searching for any sign of movement, but the darkness seemed to swallow everything it didn't want him to see. His hands rested on the railing, the cold iron biting into his palm. He didn't realize how tightly he was gripping it until his knuckles ached. Somewhere deep inside, a thought he had buried for decades began to stir. The child moved to his side, their gaze fixed on the water. "It's not over," they said, the words almost lost in the roar. Elias turned, the lens's beam sweeping over their face, revealing the certainty in their eyes. He wanted to ask what they meant, but the question felt too heavy. Like speaking it would give it more power. Instead, he looked back at the sea, the rhythmic crash of the waves sinking with the pounding in his chest. He didn't know if it was fear or something older, something closer to regret. Without thinking, Elias closed his eyes. The sound of the storm faded just enough for another memory to slip in. The night he had stood in this very spot, watching helplessly as a smaller figure was swallowed by the dark water below. His son's name had been a prayer and a scream all at once, but neither had been answered. Since that night, his faith had been a locked door he refused to open. Now, with the child beside him and the storm clawing at the glass, he felt his hand on that latch again. He stepped back from the railing and knelt on the wooden platform, his knees protesting the movement. The child stared wide-eyed as Elias bowed his head. The words came haltingly at first, rusty from years of silence. "Lord, I don't know if you still hear me, but if you do, I can't lose another tonight." The wind rattled the panes, but he kept going, each sentence steadier than the last. "Give me the strength I don't have. Give me the light I can't see. Hold back these waters if you can." The beam from the lens passed over them again, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor like reaching hands. The child's small fingers found his, gripping tight, their skin cold and damp. Elias didn't pull away. For the first time in years, the act of praying didn't feel like talking into emptiness. It felt like being heard, though he couldn't explain why. The air in the tower seemed different now, heavier, but charged with something more than the storm's electricity. A deep, hollow boom echoed from somewhere beyond the glass, pulling both their gazes to the sea. The light swept over the waves just in time to reveal a massive shadow sliding beneath the surface, too large to be a boat, too fast to be a drifting log. Elias's breath caught in his throat. The child's grip on his hand tightened, nails pressing into his skin. Neither of them spoke. The shape vanished into the black water, leaving only ripples that the wind quickly erased. The prayer hung between them, unfinished but alive. Outside, the storm didn't weaken, but something in Elias did. Something heavy that had been holding him under for decades. He didn't know what the shadow was or why it seemed to circle the lighthouse, but he knew one thing. The night was far from over, and his prayer might be the only thing standing between them and whatever waited in the dark. The beam of the lens kept sweeping across the storm, a slow, deliberate pulse that cut through the chaos like a heartbeat in the dark. Elias stood at the center of the tower room, the rhythmic hum of the machinery beneath the floor steady against the frenzy outside. The sound had been with him for half a century, mechanical, predictable, unchanging. Tonight, it felt different. Each rotation seemed to speak, as if the lighthouse itself knew it was more than steel and glass. It was a lifeline. The child stayed close, their gaze following the beam as though it could protect them. The walls vibrated with each gust and water streaked across the cracked panes, distorting the flashes of lightning. Elias adjusted the gears with a practiced hand, his movements sure despite the trembling in his chest. "As long as this light stays on," he murmured, "someone will find their way." It wasn't clear if he meant the ships out at sea or himself. The child didn't answer, but their expression shifted. Something between belief and the faintest spark of hope. Outside, the waves kept hammering the shore, relentless, but the heartbeat of the lens never faltered. He remembered nights when the light had failed. Once, in a winter storm, the mechanism froze, and by the time he'd fixed it, the Coast Guard had recovered a wreck. The guilt had stayed with him, feeding the quiet belief that his work mattered less than the ocean's will. But tonight, standing here with the storm raging and a fragile life depending on him, Elias felt the opposite. Every sweep of the light was a declaration, a refusal to give the dark the final word. The child's voice broke the rhythm. "It's not just a storm out there," they said softly, their eyes fixed on the black water below. Elias followed their gaze but saw nothing beyond the roiling sea. "Something's moving," they added, their tones steady despite the words. Elias wanted to dismiss it, to call it imagination shaped by fear, but the memory of that shadow under the waves returned too vividly. He tightened his jaw and adjusted the lens again, sending its beam further into the void. The floor beneath them shivered, not from the wind this time, but from something deep and heavy against the outer wall. The child stepped back instinctively, their hand brushing his. Elias stayed still, listening, counting the seconds between the impacts. 3, then 2, then none. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been, pressing against his ears until even the hum of the machinery seemed distant. A sudden flare of lightning illuminated the dock far below, and for a fraction of a second, Elias saw a dark figure standing at the edge. Not the shape of a fisherman or a sailor. This one stood too still, too certain, as though the storm didn't touch it. When the darkness returned, the figure was gone. Elias felt the familiar pull of dread in his stomach, but he said nothing to the child. Fear was already thick enough in the air. The lens completed another rotation, the beam passing over the water with its steady, patient sweep. Elias rested his hand on the cold brass casing, the vibration running through his fingertips like the beat of a living thing. He realized he'd been holding his breath and let it out slowly, feeling the weight in his chest ease, if only slightly. The light might not chase away whatever was out there, but as long as it shone, they weren't completely at the mercy of the night. Down below, another hollow knock echoed against the stone base of the lighthouse, rising up through the spiral of stairs. Elias turned toward the sound, his pulse sinking with the slow rotation of the lens. Whatever was outside wasn't giving up, and neither was he. The storm could roar, the shadows could wait, but the light would keep its heartbeat, one sweep at a time. The knock came again, louder this time, echoing up the spiral staircase until it settled like a weight in Elias's chest. He turned from the lens, the child instinctively stepping closer to him, eyes fixed on the trapdoor far below. The wind roared around the tower, rattling the panes in their frames, but the sound from beneath was distinct, deliberate. Elias's hand found the railing, the cold iron grounding him as his thoughts fought between two truths. The storm was dangerous enough on its own, and yet something else was here. A sudden gust slammed into the lighthouse, shaking the structure in a way Elias had never felt. The lantern by the wall swung violently, its chain straining with each arc. The child flinched, pressing their small hands over their ears. Elias crouched, speaking low, his voice firm despite the pulse pounding in his temples. "We hold our ground," he said. The child nodded, though their wide eyes betrayed how hard that would be. Outside, a crack of lightning lit the sea in blinding white, and that's when Elias saw it. The dock, barely visible through the driving rain, rose unnaturally with a massive swell. Water crashed over its surface, tearing loose ropes and scattering crates like toys. and at the far end, for the briefest second, a shadow moved against the current, not away from shore, but toward it. The image burned into his vision even as darkness fell again. He didn't know if it was man or something else, but he knew its intent. It was coming closer. Elias grabbed the rope coiled near the wall and slung it over his shoulder. The child shook their head immediately. "Don't go," they said, voice breaking. But the dock wouldn't survive another hit, and if whatever was out there made it to the shore, the lighthouse might not be their safe haven for long. "I'm not going far," he lied, though both of them knew the lie for what it was. His boots pounded the spiral stairs, each step reverberating in the stone. The moment he pushed open the lower door, the storm hit like a living thing, tearing at his coat and shoving him sideways. The rain was no longer rain. It was a wall of water flung from every direction. The path to the dock was almost gone, half submerged under the rising tide. Elias leaned into the wind, forcing each step forward, the rope dragging through the water at his side. His eyes scanned the dock for the shadow, but the storm played tricks, turning every movement into a threat. A massive wave rose without warning, curling high above him before slamming down with crushing force. The impact ripped the rope from his grip and threw him hard against the railing. His breath left him in a sharp gasp as the cold swallowed him to the waist. The dock groaned beneath the weight of the water, planks shifting under his boots. Somewhere behind the roar, a faint voice called his name. He couldn't tell if it was the child or something else entirely. He staggered to his feet, grabbing the rope again, but another blow hit, this time not from the water, but from something striking the dock from beneath. The jolt nearly sent him over the edge. He dropped to one knee, clutching the slick wood, heart racing. The water foamed and swirled, as though something massive moved just below the surface. He caught a glimpse of it, dark, shapeless, but too intentional in its motion to be debris. A crack split the night, sharp and final, the sound of wood giving way. The far end of the dock tilted violently, one of the pilings snapping free. Elias's pulse roared in his ears. The next wave would finish the job, tearing the dock into the sea, and if he was still on it when that happened, there'd be no coming back. The dock lurched beneath Elias, a living, groaning thing ready to collapse into the black water. He dropped the rope, both hands gripping the railing as the wind tried to pry him free. Salt spray stung his eyes, blurring the line between sea and sky. Somewhere in that chaos, a voice rose, not from the storm, but through it. Low at first, almost lost in the roar, then stronger, urgent. It called his name. He turned, half expecting the child to be standing on the path, but the figure he saw was taller, broader, framed in the sweep of the lighthouse beam. The wave came then, towering and merciless. Elias had just enough time to brace before it crashed over the dock, ripping loose the boards under his feet. His boots skidded across the slick wood, the current clawing at his legs with a force that pulled at bone. His grip slipped, one hand, then the other. In the cold seconds before the water swallowed him, he thought of his son, the last time he had felt this helpless, the last time he had failed to hold on. This was how it ended, until another hand closed around his wrist. The grip was strong, calloused, impossibly steady against the storm's pull. Whoever it was braced themselves on the tilted dock, hauling Elias back with a strength that felt inhuman. His boots found purchase on the jagged edge of a remaining plank, and he scrambled toward them, lungs burning with the taste of brine. The figure leaned into the effort, their face hidden in shadow, their coat snapping like a flag in the wind. For a moment, Elias thought he heard the faint murmur of a prayer over the chaos. When they reached solid footing near the base of the dock, Elias collapsed against the railing, coughing hard. The stranger knelt beside him, but before he could speak, Lightning split the sky, and the light revealed the path to the lighthouse. Empty. No figure. No rescuer. Just the wind twisting the rain into ghostly shapes. Elias froze, his mind scrambling to bridge what his body knew had happened and what his eyes now told him was impossible. The child was waiting at the lighthouse door, clutching the frame with white-knuckled hands. Their eyes widened when they saw him, then flicked past him to the empty dock. "I saw them," they said breathlessly. "They pulled you back." Elias didn't answer right away, his pulse still too loud in his ears. Instead, he followed the child inside, the warmth of the cedar fire wrapping around them like a fragile shield. He peeled off his coat, water pooling at his feet, and hung it by the door. The child stayed close, their gaze darting to the windows every time the beam swept past. Elias wanted to tell them it was over, that the worst had passed, but the truth sat heavy in his chest. The storm still raged, and the knocks from below had returned, each one sharper than before. Whatever had saved him wasn't done with them yet. The rope lay coiled by the hearth, untouched since he'd first grabbed it. He stared at it for a long moment, the coarse fibers glistening with water. He thought about the hand that had pulled him back, the impossible steadiness in that chaos. Whether it had been flesh and blood or something beyond, he didn't know. What he did know was that it had answered his prayer in the tower. And now, with the storm pressing harder against the walls, he wondered if another prayer would be enough for what was coming next. The first hint of dawn came as a faint silver line on the horizon, almost hidden behind the restless wall of clouds. Elias stood at the lighthouse window, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. The storm had lost some of its fury, the wind shifting from a howl to a deep, tired moan. Rain still fell, but in softer sheets, like the sky had finally begun to release its grip. The child stood beside him, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for proof that morning was real. Each sweep of the beam now cut through mist instead of rain, a gentler light after the night's violence. Down below, the dock was barely holding together, parts of it splintered and dangling into the tide. The sea, though calmer, still moved with a slow, heavy swell that hinted at its power. Elias traced the path from the broken planks back to the base of the lighthouse, replaying the moment he'd been pulled to safety. His fingers tightened around the mug. The hand that saved him had left no footprints, no sign, nothing but the memory of its grip and the echo of a voice he couldn't name. The child shifted closer, speaking in a voice just above a whisper. "Do you think it's gone?" Elias kept his eyes on the water. "The storm?" The child shook their head, their gaze sliding toward the black depths near the dock. Elias followed it, and for a moment he swore he saw a ripple that didn't match the current, something moving just beneath the surface, slow and deliberate. He blinked and it was gone, leaving only the faint slap of water against wood. A pale beam of sunlight broke through a gap in the clouds, striking the far edge of the water. For a heartbeat, the ocean shimmered in gold and silver, and the lighthouse's shadow stretched long across the waves. It was the kind of light that usually meant safety, but today it felt fragile, as though the wrong move could shatter it. The warmth on Elias's face was real, yet his shoulders stayed tense, his body still braced for a fight that might not be over. They moved to the tower room together, climbing the spiral stairs slowly, the damp stone cold under their hands. From the top, the view was clearer, patches of blue sky beginning to push through the gray, the fishing boats still anchored inland, waiting for calmer seas. The heartbeat of the lens continued its patient sweep, a reminder that the lighthouse had done its job. Yet Elias couldn't shake the feeling that its light had been meant for more than ships last night. The child leaned against the glass, their breath fogging a small circle. "It feels different," they said. Elias knew what they meant. The air carried a strange stillness, the kind that settles after something unseen has passed through. He let the silence sit between them, unwilling to name it. The hum of the machinery filled the space, a steady anchor against the uncertainty. Below, a faint sound drifted up, a single knock against the stone. It was softer than before, almost polite, but it was there. Elias's grip on the railing tightened. He glanced at the child who had already turned toward him, eyes wide. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the clouds thinned, and sunlight touched more of the water. The day was coming, but the night had left something behind. Elias let out a slow breath, one hand resting on the lens as it made another rotation. The light swept over the waves, and for a moment, he thought he saw a dark shape far out to sea, moving away. Whether it was retreat or patience, he couldn't tell. The horizon brightened, the wind eased, and the sea breathed in long, deep swell. But Elias knew, dawn didn't always mean safety. Sometimes it just meant the waiting had begun. By midday, the sea had settled into a slow, rhythmic roll, the kind that whispered of calm, yet carried the weight of what had passed. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, streaked with the faintest traces of the storm's retreat. Elias moved through the lighthouse with quiet steps, checking each room as though making sure the walls themselves had survived. The child followed at a distance, their small hand brushing along the cool stone as they walked. Every corner smelled faintly of salt and cedar, the storm's scent lingering like a memory. In the entryway, the rope he'd dropped the night before still lay coiled near the hearth. He picked it up, the coarse fibers rough against his skin, and for a moment he imagined that impossible grip again, the one that had pulled him back from the edge. He didn't speak of it to the child. Some things were better kept between a man and the sea, or perhaps between a man and God. Still, as he hung the rope back on its hook, he felt a quiet certainty that he hadn't been alone on that dock. They stepped outside together, the air crisp, gulls wheeling overhead as if nothing had happened. The dock was a ruin now, only the first few yards still intact, the rest scattered like bones along the shoreline. Elias stood there a long while, the child beside him, both watching the water. A patch of sunlight broke through, glinting off the waves in a way that made the whole scene feel almost sacred. The child glanced up at him, eyes steady, as if asking silently whether they were truly safe. He didn't answer right away. Instead, Elias led them back to the tower. The climb felt lighter than it had in years, each step measured but free of the heaviness that had lived in his legs since the night he lost his son. At the top, the view was clear for miles, open water stretching to the horizon, the beam of the lens sweeping its steady arc. He placed a hand on the brass casing, feeling the hum travel into his palm, and for the first time in decades, it didn't feel like just a machine. It felt like purpose. He spoke then, not to the child, but to the room, to the light, to the sea, and to God. As long as I'm here, this light will burn, not just for the ships, but for anyone who finds themselves lost in the dark. The words carried in the quiet, wrapping around the walls like the echo of a promise. The child's small hand slipped into his, their grip warm and certain. For a moment, the world outside felt distant, held at bay by the beam's steady heartbeat. From far below, the faintest knock came against the stone, so soft it could have been the tide, so steady it could have been something else entirely. Elias didn't flinch. He simply looked out over the water, the corners of his mouth lifting in something between defiance and peace. Whether the shadow had gone or would return one day, he knew now he wouldn't face it alone. The lens turned once more, its light sweeping the waters as the sun began its slow descent. Elias's voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of truth. This is my post, my calling, and I will keep it. The sea answered with a long, low sigh, the kind only a keeper would notice. Somewhere in that sound was the echo of the night before, a reminder and a promise. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? Psalm 27:1. Some nights mark you forever. They begin with a storm and end with a silence so deep it feels like the world is holding its breath. Elias Turner would never forget the taste of the salt on that wind, the sound of a child's cry carried through the darkness, or the way a hand, seen and unseen, pulled him back from the edge. The dock was gone now, the sea calmer, but the memory of what had moved beneath those waves would never truly leave him. And maybe it wasn't meant to. The lighthouse still stood, its beam sweeping across the horizon, steady as a heartbeat in the dark. Elias knew now it wasn't just steel, glass, and gears. It was a promise, a vow to stand between the lost and the deep, between fear and the fragile light of hope. He had prayed that night, not for calm seas, but for strength to stand in them. And the answer had come, not in the way he expected, but in the way he needed. The child stayed in the keeper's care for days after, both of them bound now by more than the storm. In the quiet moments, Elias caught them watching the water with the same wary respect he carried in his own bones. They didn't speak much of that night. Some stories are kept in the spaces between words. But when the lens turned and the light swept the waves, they stood together, two silhouettes in the glow, guardians of the coast and of each other. Storms would come again, he was sure of it. Shadows would test the shore, and the sea would try to take what it could. But Elias was no longer the man who kept the lighthouse out of habit. He was its keeper in truth, in calling, and in faith. And when the waters rose, as they always would, his light would be ready. Some storms never leave you. They carve themselves into your bones, into the way you breathe when the wind changes, into the way you listen for what might be calling from the dark. Elias Turner faced that night with nothing but a rope, a lantern, and a prayer he thought he'd forgotten how to say. And somehow, through hands he could not explain, he was pulled back, not just from the water, but from the years he'd been drowning in silence. Now, the lighthouse stands as more than stone and steel. Its light is a promise that when the waters rise, when the shadows test the shore, someone will still be standing between the lost and the deep. And Elias knows that someone will be him.